Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome to Unit 1 of Rhetorical Criticism. Today, we are in Part 2, that of the I.C.A.R.E method. I-C-A-R-E, I care. I do care. We have one objective today. By the end of this class, you should be able to summarize the steps of rhetorical criticism. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 3. This class uses the I.C.A.R.E method to analyze rhetoric for our rhetorical criticism, and it was developed by the illustrious Dr. Robert Rowland of the University of Kansas. I actually took a class. I took something very similar to this class when I was a student at University of Kansas many years ago from Dr. Rowland. It was awesome. Since then, he's developed this method known as the I.C.A.R.E method, and it's actually an acronym that stands for the Individual, Choice, Analysis, Research, and Evaluation. Let's begin with the question of the individual. So successful rhetoric is always audience driven. And I think that's the important part. We got to come back that if a piece of rhetoric is successful or a failure, it's all about whether or not it responds to the audience. And that's the whole game to do so. So the successful rhetoric is audience driven, but when we operate as analysts, it's important to remember that we are almost never the intended audience for the rhetor. Like, the rhetor was not saying that one day, boy, I sure hope somebody at St. James Academy goes and studies this piece for an intro to rhetoric course. Like, I just don't think that that's going to be what they're thinking. So we are rarely the audience for it. So, as analysts, we operate as individuals. We are the ones that are doing the work on it. And we have all of our skills as rhetorical analysts, or our handicaps, the baggage that we bring into the deal, that any individual brings in anything. And that's true for you, and that's true for me. Now, I also need to say that we're not going to totally get lost in what it means for the individual in this course, for a rhetoric course. I do think it's a really fun discussion to talk about, like, an individual in an audience, and how is it received to an individual person onto it. It's going to be mostly outside of the scope of this course, but it's important to remember that we are always dealing with the subjective nature of interpretation, and that we were probably not the people that the speech was intended for. But the second part I want to talk about is the C of the acronym I-C-A.R.E, I-C-A.R.E, and it's of choice. Now, again, in a high school intro to rhetoric class, I'm going to do really the choosing for you. But if you continue to study the subject, if communication is something that piques your interest, you want to keep developing on it, you will have a lot of things on your plate of what you're choosing to analyze. The four things, that basically come to mind when you're choosing what you're going to do, and it's the steps that I've considered on this one, and it's the steps that you would do if you were considering your own research. And the first one is immediacy. When something is timely and present in front of you, then that's might be what you're studying. So, for instance, if there's some notable speech being given by the president, it's the State of the Union address, something like that. Its immediacy is what throws it up there. Was this a successful speech at meeting the piece onto it? So it's something that's timely, and it's something that's presented to you. You might also consider representativeness. So let's say that you were studying the presidential rhetoric of Jimmy Carter, right? And you would look at what is a very representative speech that he would do. What's typical of a Jimmy Carter approach? How is he going to go frame this subject? How is he going to do the research on it? How is he going to set it? What's his settings going to be? What's his style of approach? Is he, a storyteller? Is he a facts layouter? That's not a word, but is this a representative piece? Is this in the style of Jimmy Carter? So that's representativeness. But you might also consider distinctiveness. If something is different than everything else, if the rhetor has chosen a distinct way of telling the story or making the case or approaching the persuasion that is different from his or her typical way for it, well, then its distinctiveness might also show up in your choice of what you're going to choose to analyze. And also of relevance. Sometimes a selection gives a particular insight into what it is that you're trying to study, what the important event that you've got in front of you, or the way that if you're studying a particular rhetor or an event or a style of rhetoric, something like that something relevant, this matters here. So if I am studying presidential tragedy rhetoric, then I would need to choose something that's relevant to a presidential tragedy. For the purposes of this class, though, like I said, the instructor is going to be choosing the pieces for you. I have chosen the selections that we're going to use for the rest of the semester, but sometimes that will fall to you if you continue to study the subject. Subpoint D is the analysis. It is the A in C.A.R.E. Analysis is the majority of our work in this class. Most of what we're going to do is analysis work. And you are the analyst. You are the one that's going to do the criticism. You're the one that's going to break down the pieces onto it, and you are the analyst. So the job of the analyst first is to figure out what is the message of the piece. What does the rhetor want me to believe? And sometimes the rhetor will just outright say it. They will say, I want you to vote for this candidate. I want you to support this issue. I want you to buy this product. Whatever. Sometimes they will just lay it out for you. This is what we want out of it. And sometimes you need to do a little interpretation. Sometimes it's being, hidden covertly in a course of message, or you need to figure out what has been implied in the course of the rhetoric. Supporting reasoning and evidence is also the job of an analyst. You need to figure out what it is that the rhetor is doing to bolster his or her purpose. So what evidence is he or she bringing to the conversation? What are the facts being laid out? What is the story they're being telling? What is the setting that they are creating for it? What are the pieces that they're bringing there? What is the supporting evidence and the reasoning for it? That's going to be an important part for you to identify when you're doing your analysis. And then, lastly, one of my favorite discussions, and then we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the semester, is what role is the rhetor playing? Now, speakers often take a type of persona, a character that they're playing for their important work to relate the message to the audience. And here I don't mean necessarily like they're putting on a costume and playing a role, although they might be. That's probably not most of the time what they're going to do. But, a rhetor might take, different points of view on it. So I think like the United States president often takes the job of commander-in-chief. That is the role they're playing. They're going to lay out the hard facts and say, this is what we want for our United States security. But sometimes the president plays America's grandpa and tries to shape the way that the policies want to be made, or a hard situation. They're trying to be supporting and give a speech and give you a Werther's original at the end of it, whatever it would be. So every rhetor is going to be playing a role. Sometimes they're super clear, sometimes they're not super clear. It's a really fun discussion, and I can't wait for us to do it together. There are some important pieces of the analyst step, and it's, like I said, the bulk of what we do is as an analyst, and there's some more pieces to remember this. The first one is that you need to keep critical distance. You need to separate your opinions of the rhetor from the subject or the actual rhetoric at hand. So take, for instance, say you are studying the presidential rhetoric of Jimmy Carter, and you just love Jimmy Carter. What a guy, right? And he's your dog. He's your favorite president in American history, something like that. And you're looking at a piece that, honestly, maybe it's a bad piece of rhetoric. Maybe it didn't work. Maybe it was a rhetorical failure on it. You have to separate, what is it today, the art from the artist. You have to separate your opinions of Jimmy Carter from Jimmy Carter's rhetoric, or the other way around. So, or say it's a situation that you absolutely dislike. You are studying, dangerous or incendiary rhetoric of, countergroups, something like that. And you're like, man, I really hate the way this is destructive to society. And you're going to watch that rhetoric, and you're going to read it, and you're going to see the pieces on it, and you're like, oh, these guys are the bad guys. And maybe they are the bad guys. I don't know. But that's not actually what you're doing. You're separating your opinion from the rhetoric. Was it successful at reaching the rhetoric scores with the audience they laid out? So you have to have some critical distance with it. It's a very important part, and you'll need to separate that from that. Separate, as they say, the art from the artist. But I also want to talk about completeness. Now, completeness is an important part for the analyst step. It is sometimes easier for an analyst to look at the individual pieces of the rhetoric than it is to tie them all together. We get lost into like, man, that is an excellent piece of rational argument. And they really walked through all of the steps, the claim, the evidence, the warrant. It's a really tight piece of rhetoric. And you're like, yes, that completeness is really awesome. But they fit that inside of a narrative arc that doesn't make any sense. And suddenly the rational argument, when put into a story of real life, doesn't hold up anymore. You have to see the individual parts, but you have to see them in the context of the whole. Rhetors use individual parts to tie together the pieces of their rhetoric to the goal that they want to achieve. And, sometimes a person is a really good storyteller, and they can just draw you in and pull you into the story. But if the story doesn't advance the goal, or if the story is a mismatch to the rest of the pieces of the rhetoric, then there's a good chance that it may not be successful rhetoric, that it's actually kind of falling apart onto that. And it's also worth remembering that all rhetoric is audience-centered. And as we said earlier, you are almost never the audience. So no rhetor has ever sat down and produced a piece of rhetoric so that it would be one day analyzed in a high school classroom one day. Nobody's ever said like, yes, I can't wait for Mr. Wahlberg to go assign this in his class. And it's not our goal. It's not actually our goal to go find the hidden messages as if rhetoric was some kind of mystery novel, like a thriller that you got to go put all the parts to it. Our goal is to understand how the audience would understand the rhetoric. And if we're not the audience, to put ourselves in the shoes of the audience and understand what's the needs of the audience, and to figure out how they would approach it. So that's the parts of that. So, and then there's the research stage. So the R is the research stage of I care. So we've done individual, we've done choice, we've done analysis, and now we're to research. And the research stage is maybe one of the most complicated for a high school student to get their hands on. So the analyst needs to learn as much as possible about the situation of the audience and of the setting, because that's going to be really the issue. Now, we will also need to know what is the situation that they're going on to, what is the rhetoric, like what is the backstory of why the rhetor is giving this. Sometimes that's complicated, sometimes it's pretty straightforward onto it. And the audience, again, when we're trying to figure out our audience stuff, sometimes that's straightforward and sometimes that's a little more complicated. We'll do our best on it. So, and if we're dealing with something modern, if we are working on modern rhetoric, you probably don't need as much research from something from a different time or place or culture. If you are trying to break down the rhetoric of TikTok videos, which we're probably not going to do. But if you did, like, you live in the era of TikTok, you generally know the issues that are going on there. It's much different than if we were to, say, pull out a piece of rhetoric from Cicero, one of the people of the great era of antiquity, and he had some really awesome rhetoric. But you're probably going to need to do more backstory search on Cicero than you would on whatever your favorite TikTok celebrity is. Are there TikTok celebrities? There shouldn't be TikTok celebrities. But I also want to say that research can sometimes complicate your analysis. Sometimes we get caught up in all of the details of the research and like, man, I need to know more about this audience. And you get into the weeds of it. And then this is a temptation in anybody who does research. You fall down the rabbit hole of research and you forget the big picture of what is going on here in this piece. So, I'm going to do my best to guide your research step to get you pointed in the ways that you need to know, which is appropriate to a high school introductory class. If you continue to study this subject, like, the reins will be handed over to you for what kind of research you need to do and how you're going to break into it. But, for the purpose of a high school introduction class, the research we need to do is basically like Wikipedia level research. Let us not complicate this. You have a couple of goals in a research stage. You need to understand the time and the culture and the place and the setting, as well as the mindset of the audience, and also to find what does the rhetor's advantages and barriers present themselves for. So every rhetor has certain things they have working in their favor, and every rhetor has some things that are not working in their favor. That'll be part of your analysis step. What barriers do they have in reaching their audience, and what advantages do they have in reaching their audience? And then the last step is the E step, the explain step. The explain step is to say, why did the rhetor succeed or fail in reaching his or her purpose? Like, what was the thing that made the difference on it? We want to look at this in a meaningful way. So to figure out, one of the last questions I'm going to ask you in almost every piece that we study is, was it successful rhetoric? And it's not, do you like the rhetoric? Although that could be part of your analysis. The question is, did it reach the audience in a way that was meaningfully reinforcing of a point of view? Like, did it encourage people to change their mind or reinforce a position they hold? Was it a persuasive piece of rhetoric? That's what you need to do. Was it successful in reaching its goal? And you're going to focus, again, on the rhetoric, the piece that you are studying, not on the person, not on the policy, not on the ideology for it. And it's also worth saying that you're not going to necessarily look on whether or not the policy or goal was reached. So, for instance, one of the things we often do is study political rhetoric. It's a classic piece of American study, and American politicians are very good people at presenting rhetoric. It's one thing that we expect out of our rhetors to be able to do, our politicians to be able to make their case for it. But you might look at it and you say, man, when it came down to it, that candidate said to vote for them, and they didn't. They lost the election. Was it unsuccessful rhetoric if they lost their case? And maybe, but maybe not. Actually, the results of an election are more complicated than any particular speech on it. And so you can't look at it like, well, Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election, and so therefore his rhetoric was a failure. Actually, that's not the way we're going to measure success or failure of rhetoric. It's whether or not it reached the audience it was intended to reach for. When rhetoric, when you're judging it, you need to decide, was it effective? Was it truthful? Did it have an ethical quality to it? If a rhetor is trying to persuade an audience, but to do it by deceiving or lying to their audience, that is not successful rhetoric. Lying to your audience does not make successful rhetoric. So it has to be presented truthfully in a way that really matters. When rhetoric fails, it is almost always the reason that rhetoric has failed, because it didn't address a major problem in a meaningful way. The rhetor did not use strategies which maximized their advantages and mitigated their barriers in a way that reached the audience for. So, like, in almost every case, that's it. Now, I can't wait to tell you more about it. This is such a fun topic, and we're going to break it open all semester. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.